A giant, boxy green and yellow trailer arrived a day after us. An enormous metal box packed full with boxes, and from the boxes marched a parade of things, each needing to find a place. Big things marched into empty rooms, rooms ready and waiting for them, a bedroom for the bed, a dining room for dining tables and chairs, a living room for a couch. From some boxes tumbled clothes, warm clothes and light clothes, fancy clothes and simple clothes, each finding a place in a closet or dresser. From smaller boxes came books of every size, each finding a place where it belonged. Cookbooks to the kitchen and studious books to the study, piles of paperback fiction still lingering in their boxes, waiting to be given a place. Dishes and glasses and cookware, paintings and wall hangings and carpets and the felt piece of a whirling dervish that came from Turkey. Vacuum and laundry baskets. An iron without an ironing board. In moving into a new home, nothing is more clear than this. Everything longs for a place where it belongs. And every place has something it can hold. From time to time, we long to be held in this place, this sanctuary made to hold us in our despairs and our hopes, our tears and our laughter. Whatever we are holding, this sanctuary holds us, offering a place where the soul wholly belongs. Sometimes we are the homemakers, giving a place for each thing in the houses that have been built. And sometimes we are the ones tumbling wide-eyed from the boxes, hoping that others have prepared a place for us. Whoever you are today, homemaker or the seeker longing for home, may each of us find peace here now. May each of our hearts be held in the stillness of this sanctuary, knowing this place of silence to be our own together. This last week we visited the Vancouver Art Gallery. About halfway into our stroll with the stroller through the Picasso exhibit they've got right now, which I do recommend if you're interested in his life and more importantly the life of the women around him he didn't necessarily treat all that well. We were walking, we were strolling, we had our stroller, and a security guard approaches Emily. He says, "Excuse me, miss, you can't have that here." Emily looked down at all that she was holding. The diaper bag stuffed with the baby gear, and the large water bottle, and the sweater, and a small notebook and pen, and the 10-month-old child who was not happy in the stroller right that minute. And she said, what? It was the water bottle. He pointed to the water bottle. So Emily nodded, and she tucked it deep inside of her bag. And later when we were preparing this sermon, she told me that for the rest of that visit, she was hyper aware of that water bottle, sitting, that illicit water bottle, at the bottom of her bag. So all that we carry with us, all that we are expected to leave at coat check, or else have to tuck away and pretend that we don't have. With the autumn equinox this week, we enter a season in which it is routine, although we understand maybe it's more routine more often than not here, to take off our shoes as we enter a home, set aside our jackets and layers as we arrive, And often we notice we set aside more than our physical layers when we come into a new place. A friend of mine describes how when she visits her conservative extended family, she is aware that she checks more at the door than her muddy shoes and jacket. She also has to put aside her radical queer and feminist politics, peel back her opinions on recent events, stuff down, perhaps, the feelings that have collected inside of her since the last visit. She has to check a lot of who she is at the door in order to come in and be with that family. There's a quote by the author Starhawk. She's a neo-pagan, beautiful writer who, it's a quote that's stayed with me for a long time now. It says, "We are longing to go home. We are all longing to go home to some place we have never been. A place half remembered and half envisioned we can only catch glimpses of from time to time. Community. Somewhere there are people to whom we can speak with passion without having the words catch in our throat. Somewhere a circle of hands will open to receive us. Eyes will light up as we enter. Voices will celebrate with us whenever we come into our own power. Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done, arms to hold us when we falter, a circle of healing, a circle of friends, some place where we can be free." Have you been part of such a circle of healing, such a circle of friends? Do you have a group that you're part of where you feel just totally safe and accepted? A group that you feel like you can pretty much share whatever is going on for you, it will be received and understood, where you don't feel like you have to risk your belonging in the group to share something vulnerable. Now, that's the benchmark. So if you visualize, if you have that experience, now or in the past, visualize that group in your mind, and imagine them even just a circle arrayed around you. What do you notice about them? What makes this group so special, so safe? Is it the length of time that you've known each other? Is it stories that have been shared or experiences that you've had together? Is it about what you have in common that makes this group feel safe? It may or may not be, but I do think that there is a story that lives among us. I think it's in most of our psyches at a subconscious level, that it is what we have in common that creates safety and belonging. At its most basic level, it's about how our brains operate to categorize. It's taught fairly early on. There's a song from Sesame Street you might be familiar with. One of these things is not like the other, thank you. One of these things just doesn't belong. Right? This is how our brains operate. It's a good training to learn how to categorize and match. But the phenomenon is universally human. It happens even, I think, in an enlightened, pluralistic country like Canada, that we ascribe that social belonging to those commonalities beyond just matching things, right? The social psychologist Mazrin Banaji says the mind is a difference-seeking machine. Her decades of research on how our brains perceive and handle difference, she's discovered that this primary capacity of our brains is what helps us to order and navigate, she says, the overwhelming complexity of reality. So it's important. It's a useful skill. And the brilliance of the human mind is how many, how quickly, how nuanced these differences can be perceived. And the brilliance of the human mind is how many, how quickly, how nuanced these differences can be perceived. And the brilliance of the human mind is how many, how quickly, how nuanced these differences can be perceived. And the brilliance of the human mind is how many, how quickly, how nuanced these differences can be perceived. And at the same time, of course, it's exactly what leads to generalizations, to stereotypes, and to prejudice. In the survival systems our brains developed long ago, those survival systems that Banaji says that lead to implicit bias, sameness, familiarity is safe, is comfortable, difference is risky, potentially dangerous, requires our attention. And so in many places, in many contexts in our lives, we seek to belong by fitting in, like that kid who needed black socks to go to school in Chicago, who Emily mentioned last week. Belonging is built on sameness, on fitting in. And when that's the case, we can feel we have to keep our identities simple and leave the rest of our lives at the door. This is the culture of many workplaces, many offices, many schools, much of public life. My guess is that everybody here has had the experience of being in a group where you felt you needed to leave some part of who you are at the door in order to belong. And so what I'm wondering today is this: are there parts of yourself that you check at the door when you come into this sanctuary? Does that coat rack in the hall hold more than our coats and hats as we gather together? One of the first things that we heard from the search committee last spring, from you all when we visited, is that you want to widen the welcome here. You want to be a community that reflects the diversity and complexity of the wider world around us. And so here's maybe a crackpot theory. If we want to welcome the wider web of our human family, we can begin by welcoming the parts of ourselves that may not feel at home here. To fully welcome our whole selves and one another may be a path towards welcoming others. So you'll let me know later if I'm totally off base here, but what are the cultural norms here? If you could capture just one cultural norm for this community, and it may be unique to us or reflective of a larger cultural one, capture it in a simple phrase. Just if you think about those for a second, and I'm going to ask actually if you're willing to just call a couple of those out. What are the cultural norms here? A simple phrase, just shout it out, yeah. Highly educated, yeah. And so you might imagine you speak articulately. That's a cultural norm. Speak clearly and succinctly, probably too. What else? Any other cultural norms that you can capture in a phrase? Politeness, yeah. Whiteness, thank you. Whiteness.
But politeness too.
Politeness too. Wow, yeah.
Politically liberal.
Politically liberal. Politically correct. Tolerant. Yeah. We could name more. We will. We'll get to it all. We'll talk more about this in classes and workshops, but as Unitarian Universalists, we are the inheritors of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, right? That's where our tradition comes from. And we've been steadily moving in some other directions in the last few decades, but that cultural DNA, it's strong. It has a bit of a highbrow attitude. It has that desire to be clean, perfect, pure, innocent. It manifests in myriad ways in the life of our community. And again, tell me later if I'm way off the mark here, but I'm guessing that it's easier to talk here about something that you recently heard on CBC than if your interests run more along the lines of The Bachelorette or reality TV. You know, if you've watched every episode of Survivor like my friend Gogi, I wonder if you'd feel comfortable talking about that here. Or if your taste in music is more punk rock, or more gospel, praise? Would you feel at home here? Or maybe it's just areas of your life that feel like they just need to be kept at the door, areas that you don't feel totally talking about here, like many places. Financial troubles, relationship issues, challenges in the family with addiction, with mental health. Or in terms of spirituality, do you ever worry that your beliefs and practices wouldn't be understood or supported if you shared them here? That's the whole project of our faith, is to welcome this wide variety of beliefs and practices, and yet are there some that we don't? It used to be the case, and still is in many places, that it is uncomfortable to come out as an atheist or a humanist. Right? There's still many places in this country, in the States, in the world, where that battle needs to be fought. And though we have proudly held up humanism as a core strand of our tradition for 2 or 3 generations now, we still have to be intentional every week to ensure that we are not unwelcoming, that we are inclusive in the language of our services. That's important. And then at the same time, I hear stories from Unitarian Universalists who feel uncomfortable sharing their theistic or other spiritual beliefs in church, feeling that they'll be looked down upon or mocked or seen as irrational. So I'm going to share a piece of a sermon that was preached at the General Assembly of congregations in the States last year in Portland, Oregon. It was shared by Marlon Lavenhar, who's the lead minister of our largest church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You may have heard some of their story. They have this fascinating story of welcoming in a black Pentecostal church after their minister discovered he could no longer preach hell and was ostracized from his denomination. So this Unitarian Universalist church there in Tulsa welcomes them all in. And boy, were they were in for a ride. So this is what Marlon said about it. Let's say, for instance, I tell you that I speak in tongues. Would you laugh at me and think I'm ridiculous? What if I believe in Jesus Christ as the incarnation of God and I read the Bible as a way of deepening my understanding of myself and the world? Can I be a member of your church? I mean, would I really feel welcome? And what if I think God is real and prayer is powerful and ritual is effective? Would your church embrace me? Would you? Because our churches are based on the premise that there is no test of faith or belief, which allows us to have an incredible diversity of believers at the table. And yet, I've seen the reaction some people get when they share certain beliefs in our congregations. And he goes on to share that 3 months after that church, All Souls Tulsa, welcomed the Pentecostal church, a long-time white member of the church walked into my office one day. He is a staunch humanist, a lawyer, about 60 years old. He said, Marlon, I want to tell you something that I never would have told anyone in this church and never have. I grew up Pentecostal, and to this day, I still speak in tongues. Marlon says, I tried to not look too surprised, but I was shocked. I asked, how often? He said probably about once or twice a week. He described it as a kind of meditation that allows his mind to rest. Once I got over my initial disbelief and quietly checked my own prejudices, Marlon writes, I was struck hardest by realizing that this is a central part of his spiritual life. And he has spent 30 years in our congregation and has never felt he could tell anyone in our church without being judged negatively and maybe even made to feel like an outsider. And he was right. And so it makes me wonder among us, Even here, even now, what stories do we keep from telling? What parts of ourselves do we tuck away deep down in the bag to ensure we will belong? And more importantly, how can we practice another way of being together? We already know a lot about it, I'm sure. This is a place of belonging and welcome, as we know. But we can do even more. So there's two sides, of course. Two sides to this welcoming our whole selves business. On the one hand, it's up to all of us to listen generously, to resist expressing judgmental reactions. How often? And instead to be led by curiosity. But on the other hand, we must be willing to risk vulnerability. Risk sharing vulnerably, knowing we can never be certain that our truths will be received as we hope. So vulnerability, it's going to get plenty of airtime later sermons as just kind of broaching the subject. Social scientists like Brené Brown, if you haven't seen her TED Talk, I highly recommend it. They're demonstrating that vulnerability is a key pathway to health and wholeness as individuals and to productive and cooperative group functioning. And it's hard. Expressing vulnerability may be the most rewarding and challenging spiritual practice in my life. Last year, Google released the results of 2 years of research they conducted on what makes for effective teams. The thoughtful analysis they presented was picked up by a number of outlets. It was the headline of a 9-part series in the New York Times Magazine on reimagining the office. The analysts, they drew out 5 keys to successful teams from the research, but the first, and what they said was the most, by far, significant to team functioning, was the level of psychological safety team members experienced. What if that was priority number 1 in the workplace, at school, in all of the groups that we belong to? Psychological safety. Charles Duhigg, the author of the New York Times piece, he explained it like this. Imagine you've been invited to join one of 2 groups. Team A, composed of people who are exceptionally smart and successful, all of them. When you watch a video of this group working, you see professionals who wait until a topic arises in which they are expert, and then they speak at length, explaining what the group ought to do. When someone makes a side comment, the speaker stops, reminds everyone about the agenda, and pushes the meeting back on track. This team is efficient. There is no idle chit-chat or long debates. The meeting ends as scheduled and disbands so everyone can get back to their desks. Team B is different. It's evenly divided between successful executives and middle managers with few professional accomplishments. Teammates jump in and out of discussions. People interject and complete one another's thoughts. When a team member abruptly changes the topic, the rest of the group follows her off the agenda. And at the end of the meeting doesn't actually end. Everyone sits around to gossip and talk about their lives. Which team, Duhigg asks, would you rather join? The group norms in that second team promote psychological safety, which is much more important for group collective intelligence than the individual strengths and expertise in Team A. And the behaviors that create that psychological safety, turning to one another and listening, tuning in, and most importantly, sharing personal stories, not just about the work culture, and vulnerability. One last example from the podcast Invisibilia. So I'm really excited about this podcast. If anybody wants to talk about it with me, it's fun. They followed the story of efforts to work on workplace safety on a Shell oil rig. It's really incredibly dangerous work, right? And horrendous injuries and death were not uncommon. The men working the rig would see coworkers injured or killed and simply soldier on. The culture was not to speak about any emotional reactions to events like that. It's all men working on these oil rigs. But instead to maintain that masculine bravado. In comes Claire Nuer, a Holocaust survivor, encounter group aficionado, who began to run some very touchy-feely groups with the oil riggers. After initial resistance, which I'm sure carried on for quite some time, the men began to tell their life stories to one another. They shared tales of addiction and illness, of abuse and trauma. They shed tears with one another. The men began to share their vulnerability, and that allowed them to lose the masculine bravado and express their uncertainty at work, to ask for help when they need it. And the result? An 84% drop in accident rates across Shell's operations in the times that these groups were happening. 84%. So I want to share one last thing with you about a place that's very important to me. It's an outdoor school. It's called the Mosaic Project. I've worked many seasons there. We teach skills for multicultural awareness, for team building and peacemaking. It comes from maybe a similar philosophy, I think, as Nuer's work with encounter groups, experiential education. And the whole place is organized, the project is organized around contact theory. Contact theory says that it's not enough for us to be in contact with people who are different than us. When we're talking about cultural differences, when we're talking about reaching across divides in our society, it's not enough to simply be around one another. We have to intentionally do activities and have conversations that address our differences. We have to talk about the differences, and we have to talk about the power. The first day when we've got these kids is grade 4 and 5, right, 10-year-olds. They're in a giant circle on the field, and the first thing we say is to have them run across the circle every which way. We have these two kids switch places, and these two kids switch places, so that everybody gets mixed up. We ask them why they did that. A couple of the smart kids realize, you're trying to get us mixed up. They're coming from their own schools. 3 different schools will be there, and they realize that you want us to get to know each other across these differences, right? And then we ask, have you ever been asked to sit next to someone and you knew that they didn't want to sit next to you? You knew you weren't welcome there? And how did you know? They start talking about the ways. It's not words. There might be some noises that the teeth suck is a common one, accompanied by the eye roll most often. And then we ask, how could we flip that script? How could we show instead that someone is quite welcome to sit next to you? And amazingly enough, of course, they know all of those behaviors as well. And with the teens who are cabin leaders and the adult staff, we'd embrace that sense of belonging, of creating those connections as well by starting each week with a little more intensive exercise. We would start each week by going around the room and saying, if you really knew me, you would know. And completing that sentence. And they ranged from the quite silly to the quite serious. Stories from childhood, things about ourselves that you wouldn't see just by looking at us. In this multicultural group of staff, people from all around the world and all different cultures, a tight-knit community was formed by sharing with one another our true stories. If you really knew me, you would know I was a chess geek in elementary school. I won a few trophies. If you really knew me, you would know that sometimes I lied about my parents, about having two moms when I was in junior high because I didn't want to become the target of other kids' bullying. If you knew me, if you really knew me, you would know that there have been years of my life where I've looked in the mirror and seen only someone terribly ugly, terribly a monster. If you really knew me, you would know that the redwood trees are where I find the deepest sense of home. I want to invite you to just take a moment and turn to someone near you. It's okay if you end up with 3 people. And just share one thing. If you really knew me, you would know something maybe that would surprise them about you. Doesn't have to go deep. Just let it be whatever your comfort level is. Don't take more of a risk than your heart will let you. But go ahead, just turn to a neighbor. If you really knew me, you would know. Just 1 or 2 of them. Go back and forth. Really, after the service, you can keep doing this all day. Great coffee conversation starter. Yeah. So I'll say this just one more time. If we're going to build that multicultural, beloved community that we dream about, that welcoming, inclusive vision that we seek to embody, then let's start right here with us, inviting one another and ourselves to bring our whole selves to this place. Let's practice risking vulnerability and receiving that risk with warmth and care. May it be so, and amen.